what does your reading of the court documents tell you about what went on when we were in an emergency situation and we needed power plants?
No, you're absolutely right, Samson. It reads like a Jeffrey Archer novel. That's completely fascinating. So sometime around 2012, Goldman Sachs, which is a massive investment bank, I think $1 trillion in assets, very powerful organization, bought shares in a company called AXA Energy, and therefore became, I think it was a minority holding of around 16%, if my memory serves me right. And therefore they became very involved in trying to find business for their portfolio company.
Right.
Around 2013, the power crisis in Ghana started to deepen, and by 2014, a strategy had been adopted by the government of the day to implement what then became known as the emergency power policy. And the idea was that we're going to look for fast-track energy projects, and that would typically mean modular energy plants. So this would be energy plants that are effective in responding to emergency needs for power. So you could literally bring them, a power plant in a box, they are often called, install them quickly, and then be able to provide power. So Goldman got wind of this, and this being Ghana, they started to look for a Ghana specialist in their team. The person who came up was Mr. Beko, who was then practicing in London as an investment banker for Goldman. And London is one of the major centers of Goldman activity worldwide. I think 20% or more of global revenue derives from London, if not more. So they approached Mr. Beko, or rather they instructed Mr. Beko, given that he was the employee, and then said to him that he should make efforts to get AXA into Ghana, because they had already discussed it with AXA, and AXA was very keen on deploying their power plants in Ghana. At that time, margins in Turkey were under huge pressure, and so AXA was looking for any opportunity to make to increase their margins. Mr. Beko then, according to the allegations, and as you've rightly pointed out, those allegations are very strongly backed by evidence. And the reason is that Mr. Beko, for some fascinating reason, together with other principals in this affair, decided to commit almost everything that they were doing to writing. And I think the view that he had was that so long as he used his personal email address, it would be impervious to audit.
Right.
So he kept saying that, only my Gmail, forgetting that, Gmail is owned by an American company, and by, since the Patriot Act days, all of this information is generally transparent.
But what he did then, according to the court documents, was a violation of his own company's regulations.
Which was why he did not want to use his official email address.
Because if he had used his official email address, it will be audited from time to time.
Periodic audit, indeed.
Right. Okay.
Indeed. So when the decision was made then to enter Ghana in 2015, Mr. Beko decided to use a consulting company. And one of the fascinating things about this this affair, is how, till date, investigative journalists in this country have not been able to unearth this consulting company. A lot of us have ideas of which company it might be, but we will keep it under wraps now for obvious legal reasons. So this consulting company had links to the government at the highest levels due to the presence, either on their board or their ownership, of what they describe as a politically exposed person.
Right.
So this person was a brother of a very senior government official. And Mr. Beko decided to engage this company with AXA, obviously to his advice, because AXA will be relying on his country knowledge. And this entity was then responsible for fast-tracking and enabling the acquisition of the right agreements, the right licenses, etc.
Right.
Remember though that this was an emergency power situation, so a lot of the rules have been relaxed. A lot of the energy commission type rules and the likes have been compressed into single panel evaluations where multiple regulators sit around the table.
For good reason.
For good reason.
Right.
The challenge though, as you might wonder, is if the country itself had a policy to fast track, then why would you need another intermediary to fast track?
Okay.
That's a very important question. We'll go back to it.
So the consulting company you talk about is the entity that the court documents refer to as the intermediary.
Indeed.
And that also, and that also is against the company's policies to have, for Beko, who is alleged to have used that entity, particularly to channel bribes.
No, he should have disclosed it.
Right.
The challenge is not that it was against Goldman's policy to use consultants, but you need to disclose that. And unfortunately, he did not disclose the nature of the transactions that these people were involved with. And in repeated disclosures to the company authority, the company head, the company compliance department, he kept ignoring or neglecting to do so. So this intermediary company then set up...
Until the legal department flagged it and requested that it be investigated.
Indeed.
And then they got to know that, in fact, something like that had happened.
Indeed.
Right.
So this is around February. The intermediary company then sets up an SPV as part of the process of being able to receive money and deploy it with very minimal financial authorities oversight. So financial oversight in this country will struggle if you're using an SPV to wire money in. Not that it's completely opaque, but it makes it much more difficult.
Right.
Now, we know that sometime around May, things have come to a head in that, through a lot of effort, they managed to get the government to sign an emergency power agreement, a EPA. The bribes now start to flow. And there are a lot of, smaller type bribes flying around, purportedly to the parliament, to officials in the government, to the civil servants, etc.
Right.
But the most interesting was $3 million paid in the month of May.
Civil servants at the power ministry, at the electricity company.
The regulators, exactly. Then the utilities themselves.
Yes.
So essentially the people that are going to be buying the power themselves were being bribed to look the other way rather than to perform due diligence to make sure that whether it's UCG or Greek or whatever, it's not being shortchanged. Right. Then the money, so about $3 million then changed hands in 2 installments in May, because in May the power agreement was signed. And the government officials then committed to get this agreement before Parliament to get ratification. And the way that the arrangement with the intermediary company had been set out was that we pay you on milestone basis.
Correct.
So when you do this for us, we pay you. And there were about 4 critical milestones. Sign the agreement, send it to Parliament, issue a letter of credit, and issue a tax waiver for the equipment that we're going to bring in.
Right.
So these 4 elements were the key milestones upon which monies were to be released.
At each point where a milestone, had been achieved, money was paid. Right.
Mr. Beckon argues that that money was being paid for activities relevant to licensing and things like that because AXA did not have full financial infrastructure in Ghana. So this intermediary was responsible for more or less acting as their local agent and therefore making payments for all these kind of regulatory costs and the rest of it. The problem is that in the emergency power arrangements that were in place then, regulatory fees were very low for obvious reasons. Right. So it's very difficult to justify $3 million for regulatory activities. Land was being provided, by the government, and often it was even issued around title and things like that were already taken care of by government. Remember the famous Ameri situation? Right. Government provided the land, then got a contractor to prepare the land, etc. So that claim is very difficult to sustain.
And that was corroborated by the CEO of the energy company, the Turkish energy company, that they had paid them in about 200 to 3 million, 200 to 300,000 US dollars for the regulatory compliance matters that they had done for them, and that they were not actually interested in using them, and they were ready to just give them a walk-away payment
that came
of
later.
about another $300,000.
That came much later. But in this period of May, the agreement had been signed. Parliament had to approve it, and to do that, about $3 million was required to facilitate that movement. Because remember, you had a politically exposed person between this intermediary and the government official. Right. And very often they would say that, we want to kick out the government official because it was being slow, and can you find somebody else? So the typical thing. And then the Ministry of Power then presented a memorandum to Parliament laying out the terms of the deal and why it was useful for Ghana at that point to ratify the deal. The problem obviously is that a lot of that information was not candid. And it's quite evident that if the Ministry of Power and other regulators were not being blinded by ulterior motives and other considerations, that should not have happened, because they went there, and one of the most egregious things they did was to design a capital recovery charge that pretends as if the power plants were going to be built anew or they were going to be purchased anew. So when you look at the tariff dedicated to capital recovery, typically you do an internal rate of return analysis or a return on investment analysis and use that to determine what the tariff for capital recovery will be. In this case, these were second-hand plants that a company was going to amass and bring in. So a proper analysis will have depressed the capital recovery and saved Ghana money.
Right.
They refused to disclose that fact. They then made additional failures. There were then additional failures to disclose around the fact that this was an HFO plant, and if you do the full analysis properly, that the analysis that they had made regarding the comparative cost between the comparison of the cost between this particular plant and other plants that were also in the emergency category were all flawed, in the sense that we're not fully disclosing the facts.
Right.
Then you find out that they also, because the way that the energy demand, given the way that fuel cost pass through and the rest works, if you work it out clearly, it's not only the capacity charge you need to look at. You need to do an analysis of the energy charge to see if, given the way that the thing has been set up, the risk that the government is absorbing through letter of credit and all of those things, that would be the reasonable charge. That information was hidden from Parliament. Nobody in Parliament decided to delve into it, given the circumstances of the case. And it's very similar to the Mary problems that, you remember our organization was very much at the forefront. So once again, we come to this issue where data is usually manipulated to serve a political end. Very often with the connivance of all levels of government, Parliament, the civil service, etc., etc., etc. Long story short, AXA, because of these failures to disclose, manages to cheat Ghana a huge amount of money, out of a huge amount of money, so that it was willing, based on the negotiations, given the documents that we have now, to pay the intermediary at that point, at this early stage of the game. They were willing to pay the intermediary $42 million. You get me? They were willing to, and Goldman Sachs was expecting to earn $10 million.
Yes, 10 million.
And there were additional disbursement, this to facilitate other people, that was costing, that must have cost at least $5 million. And there was a fee for Mr. Beckon, which later on we will discover was about $2 million.
Right.
So in total, AXA was willing to spend $60 million on everything apart from building the power plant, because it was managed to get our officials to allow them to overcharge in the simplest terms possible. So the way that they designed the tariffs, by refusing to disclose information, they had inflated the tariff, which then enabled the power company to pay these bribes, because they are profitable, profit-making company, right? So the only way they're going to pay $60 million in various, whatever you call them, bribes, facilitation fees, whatever, is if whatever profit they were going to make is substantially more than $60 million. And so when you think about it, you realize three things. One is that due to these tendencies for private interest to supersede public interest, we end up overpaying in a lot of instances, in a lot of projects in these countries. And therefore, it is warranted that the citizenry and the citizens of Ghana continue to distrust public motive. You understand me? Because we've seen from event to event, whether it's Woyomi, whether it's this AXA matter, that when it comes to their private interests, public actors, whether it's in civil servants, government officials, whatever, will place their private interests above public interest. So we have to be very careful the things they tell us. So if the Ministry of Power will go to Parliament and present information that hides the full picture in order to create a much more profitable transaction for a private company from Turkey, then it's not so surprising then that when information is put out in the public domain by officials of government, we tend to be so suspicious. Then in July, Parliament ratifies this. Okay.
Now, as you speak about the lack of disclosures, and we'll get to Professor Prempeh to look at, he has a peculiar area of interest when it comes to these matters.
He always does.
And his very good friend, Professor Kwasari, has also been speaking about the fact that the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has provided us a mounting of clues for law enforcement to quickly, indict several highly placed people for receiving bribes in the AXA energy deal, and yet we don't seem to be doing anything.
And it goes without saying that Professor Prempeh's publications on governance and the rest goes back many years.
That's correct.
He's given us a consistent overview of these matters.
That's correct. Now, they discover also that beyond the lack of disclosure, between Asante Beko and the CEO of the Turkish company, when they ask the CEO, they make enquiries or they interrogate him on issues, he would do a draft for him Asante Beko, vet. And Asante Beko will vet and revise, and you see the transformation between what he wants to communicate and what eventually Asante Beko does for him to communicate to the
And
people.
that is a very important point, because as we progress, you see how that then unfolded.
Right.
So in July, Parliament approves this or ratifies this. The issue around the letter of credit and the tax waiver becomes subject to a whole range of problems. Remember, in the memorandum to Parliament, the Minister of Power assured the parliamentarians that per the agreement, if within 30 days the conditions present had not been met, they automatically waived. So that meant, therefore, that government was effectively relieved from its duties, or sorry, its obligation to provide these other items that the company, the energy company, wanted. Government was effectively relieved. And I think there were people that were saying that, look, it was quite clear to everybody that we wanted this as emergency power. If they cannot deliver in a few months as we planned, then what's the point? And so if they're going to wait till everything else is sorted before they start acting, then they're not serious. But this started to create friction between the intermediaries and AXA. Eventually, it gets to the point where it is quite clear that Mr. Beko is acting not in the interest of Goldman. So there's a huge principal agent problem here.
Right.
Whereas an agent of Goldman, his loyalties appear to lie with AXA, which you've pointed out.
Right.
And then it gets to the head because it becomes quite clear that after the ratification of Parliament, the intermediaries might not be able to deliver.
Right.
So sometime around August of 2015, friction begins to develop between the what do you call it, the power company, AXA, and the consulting company in Ghana. And eventually decide to wrap things up by giving them, I think, $1 million and walk away. Now, Mr. Beko now starts to have issues with Goldman. I think there were now some whistleblowing activities going on and the rest of it. So Goldman starts to ask questions. He starts to enter into a very elaborate scheme not to be candid. And eventually,
not to be candid at two levels.
Yes.
At the level of the intermediary, as in Goldman, and also the holding company that the company had set up. So there were two, the holding company with a committee that he was supposed to
That is Goldman's holding company in New York.
Exactly.
And then he works in Goldman London. But the way
as a subsidiary.
The way that the system works is that they have integrated teams across subsidiaries and in head office.
That's right.
And this was the nature of the arrangement.
Right. And so he evades all the two.
Yep.
And I say he evades on the basis of the evidence
that
or the allegations contained in the suit by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission.
Which is an important point which we will come to. It's a civil suit, not a criminal. It's not criminal proceedings. So what happens then is that in March, Goldman launches official investigations, and AXA starts to collaborate gradually, start to provide some information. In May, AXA, despite the fact that Goldman has some voting rights on AXA's board, refuses to engage further on the matter. So in May, we're not going to cooperate anymore. In August, Goldman is like, we're out. We can't do this anymore.
Right.
In September, Mr. Beko continues to provide services to AXA in his own private capacity, even while employed by Goldman.
And eventually resigns.
Eventually resigns in December of 2016. And by February of 2017, he had secured the all-powerful letter of credit and tax waivers. Why did AXA need this? To make the transaction effectively risk-free. It's like, I'm not going to risk a dime here. I need a letter of credit for $100 million. I'm bringing you second-hand power plants, but I still need $100 million in a letter of credit. On top of that, I don't want to pay a single dime of tax. So I have zero risk.
Okay.
But I'm willing to pay money to get this zero risk, not to Ghana, somebody else. In February 2017, Mr. Beko had achieved these milestones, these other milestones for them, and he gets his $2 million. Which brings three issues. In fact, I'm still continuing for the first three issues because I just pointed out two.
Right.
The third issue there was that given the fact that you had a situation where the power plant was not likely to be delivered on time, the nature of this emergency power appears purely to have been a ruse to exploit to make money. Essentially, you say it's emergency power, so remove all the hurdles and all the procurement rules and the rest of it. But it doesn't come in 3 months. It doesn't come by the end of 2015. In fact, it doesn't start operating till sometime in 2018, though they start making some light test runs and the rest in 2017. It's in 2018 that full operation starts, and it's that time that they get a tax waiver. But the commitments to the letter of credit and the tax waiver have been secured by February of 2017, in that the new government had committed to do that, and therefore Mr. Beko gets his $2 million. Now, what is problematic is that when Goldman saw that, they then alerted the SEC. It's possible that there were other whistleblowers, but all the evidence, and including what has been disclosed, suggests that Goldman then actively cooperated with the SEC, because this was an employee who was breaching every etiquette in the principal agent arrangement. It's a norm. And this is when the SEC started to investigate in March 2017. They reached out to Mr. Beckon, he gave a statement, and then they went away and spent a lot of time reconstructing this whole episode. And by the time they were through, it was quite evident that the evidence for bribery was compelling. They decided then to go to the Eastern District, the U.S. court in the Eastern District in New York, and file a civil suit and disgorge Mr. Beckon of all the money that he's made.
Right. That's the primary relief they are asking from
and
the
then
court.
any other ancillary reliefs.
Okay.